Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. In all of American history, there has perhaps never been a greater wisdom writer than Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived most of his life in Concord, Massachusetts, a place renowned for producing provocative thinkers and writers. And what do I mean when I refer to Emerson as a wisdom writer? Well, wisdom writers are people who stimulate our thinking about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. Also, wisdom writers help us to understand ourselves and life at a much deeper level. Emerson can change a person's life. Emerson can help people to see much more clearly. Unlike some famous philosophers, Emerson made a serious effort to live his philosophy. He was a very sincere, courageous person who often said and wrote things which would cause him to be unpopular among many people. Being popular was not one of Emerson's values. Indeed, Emerson believed that if a person wished to be very popular, that person probably would have to sacrifice some of his or her integrity to do so. The defining issue, social issue, of Emerson's life was slavery. Slavery was not abolished in the United States until Emerson was 62 years old. Emerson believed that the majority of people is often wrong. And since he believed that slavery was immoral, he believed this was an important evidence, indication, of the majority often being wrong. Here are some quotes reflecting Emerson's distrust of the majority. Again, Emerson's distrust of the majority, not just on the issue of slavery, but also on many other issues, as you will see as I proceed with my presentation. Emerson spoke of the disgraceful deference to public opinion. And also, in perhaps what is his most famous quote, he said this: "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." He also went on to say, "Give up once and for all the hope of approbation from people in the street if you are pursuing great ends." Emerson believed that only a minority of people have wisdom. This, by the way, has been a common theme among many of the great thinkers in history. Emerson also believed that in any society, it is only a minority of people who are very decent and fair. Emerson believed that most people pretend to be more moral than they are, but that when their self-interest is at stake, they will often resort to immoral means. And what might be some examples of this? Office politics, dishonesty in business, mean-spiritedness in political campaigns. Emerson believed that if a majority of Americans had been very decent, had been very fair, they would not have permitted slavery to exist in what is now the United States for approximately 200 years. Emerson also believed that if the majority of Americans were very decent and fair, they would not have allowed the brutal treatment of American Indians. And also, he believed that if Americans had shown real wisdom and real justice, they would not have allowed a situation to prevail in the United States whereby women could not vote for the first 130 years, approximately 130 years that our Constitution was in effect. This particular quotation, I think, brings together so much of what I've said so far about Emerson. Again, his own words. society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. It is not surprising that Emerson's best friend in Concord, Massachusetts, was another nonconformist, Henry David Thoreau. And perhaps a quotation that illustrates very well Thoreau's spirit of nonconformity is the following. And again, I'm quoting Thoreau. If a person does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away. An Emerson scholar on the subject of Emerson's penchant for nonconformity said the following, and I'm quoting this scholar. Emerson's utterances were and are provocative, even inflammatory. This scholar went on to say this about Emerson. Emerson was from the 1830s to the Civil War the most urbane deviser of intellectual bombshells in the U.S. And what might be some examples of these intellectual bombshells? Well, 15 years before Lincoln was elected to the presidency, Emerson gave a fiery speech in which he called for the abolition of slavery. And for many years prior to the Civil War, Emerson made many provocative, even inflammatory speeches opposing slavery. And by the way, he sometimes endangered his life in doing so, because as a matter of fact, there were even many Northerners who believed that Emerson should not be speaking out against slavery, because they feared that Emerson was rocking the boat, so to speak. Another example of Emerson's nonconformity. In 1850, Emerson began giving speeches calling for people to disobey the fugitive slave law. Again, this was civil disobedience. Emerson calling upon people to disobey a law. And what did this law say that Emerson very much opposed? Well, the fugitive slave law was a law passed by Congress in 1850, which was an effort on the part of Congress to put pressure on Northerners to return escaped slaves. Again, it was an effort to put pressure on Northerners to return escaped slaves to the South. Well, since Emerson was opposed to slavery, he believed it was immoral to return people to slavery, and therefore he called on people to disobey the fugitive slave law. Another example of Emerson's spirit of nonconformity occurred in the 1840s when he opposed the United States going to war against Mexico. In the 1840s, the U.S. went to war against Mexico, and Emerson was convinced that we had no right to do this. He believed that this war was a provocation on the part of the United States government, that we had provoked Mexico in going to war to acquire some of its land. And indeed, we won the war and did acquire more than a little bit of Mexico's land. Originally, we said we had gone to war against Mexico to settle a boundary dispute between Texas and Mexico. Again, we claimed that certain land was ours, Mexico claimed it was theirs, so we claimed we were going to war to settle this boundary dispute. Well, after winning the war, we not only got that land that was in dispute, but we demanded of Mexico that it turn over California to us, as well as a huge part of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. Yes, it is true. California used to belong to Mexico. Most of what is now Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado used to belong to Mexico. And again, as I indicated, Emerson believed this was an immoral war, and from the outset of the war, he opposed it. I must also add that Abraham Lincoln was a member of the U.S. Congress at the time of the Mexican War, and he agreed with Emerson that the United States had no right to go to war against Mexico. And also, Ulysses S. Grant, later to become a president of the United States, fought in the Mexican War, and later on said that he believed it was an immoral war, that we really had no right to go to war against Mexico. I think it's fair to say the Mexican War is perhaps the most controversial war the United States ever fought. And what are some other examples of Emerson's independent, nonconformist spirit? Well, Emerson had 2 degrees from Harvard University, yet he had no special affection for Harvard, and Emerson was a critic of the education system in America, including universities. Emerson believed that one did not have to go to college to become well educated. Indeed, he believed that many people who had gone to college and graduated college were not well educated. So again, Emerson saw no direct correlation between having a college degree and being well educated. I'll have much more to say on Emerson's ideas concerning education later in this program and also in my next program on Emerson. Another, again, example of Emerson's nonconformity is this. Emerson was an ordained Protestant minister. He had a degree from the Harvard Divinity School. Yet, though Emerson was a very spiritual person, he was a very severe critic of organized religion. And again, I'll have much more to say about his criticisms of organized religion, either later in this program or in my next segment on Emerson. Also, Emerson was a patriotic American. Emerson was a very patriotic American, but he leveled some very serious criticisms at the American government and had very harsh words about politicians in general. Again, Emerson had some very harsh words about American politicians in general. Also, Emerson was a scholar. Indeed, Harvard University named a building after him. But even though Emerson was a scholar, he had some serious criticisms of those who were called scholars. Emerson believed that book learning was not sufficient to produce a scholar. Again, book learning was not sufficient to produce a scholar. Indeed, it was not sufficient to produce an educated person. In order for one to be a scholar, according to Emerson, one needed integrity and a great heart. Again, according to Emerson, for one to be a bona fide scholar, in addition to a person being well-read, one had to have integrity and a great heart. On this subject, Emerson said the following, and I'm quoting him: "Character is superior to intellect. Character is superior to intellect." Goethe, the famous German thinker, whom Emerson very much admired, provides some clarification of what Emerson is talking about when he says character is higher than intellect. Goethe said this. Intellect without character is far worse than character without intellect. I'll say that again. Again, these are the words of the very famous German thinker Goethe. Intellect without character is far worse than character without intellect. Emerson believed that a genuine scholar had an educated heart. A genuine scholar is a person whose learning has penetrated to his heart and soul. When Emerson said that a genuine scholar had an educated heart, what he meant, among other things, is that a true scholar was a very empathetic, compassionate, decent human being. According to Emerson, a person who has read a lot of books but who does not have a good heart remains a very ignorant person. Allow me to say that again. According to Emerson, a person who has read a lot of books but does not have a good heart remains a very ignorant person. Emerson believed that wisdom is never divorced from goodness. A wise person must be a good person. A wise person must be a good person. Again, wisdom is never divorced from goodness. And of course, there have been many great thinkers in history who, of course, agreed with Emerson. Among them, Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, Spinoza, and many others. I think Beethoven, the very famous composer, puts Emerson's thoughts into context. Beethoven said this, and I'm quoting him: "I recognize no sign of superiority among people other than goodness." I recognize no sign of superiority among people other than goodness. Also, it is interesting that many thinkers in history have seen a connection between deep thinking and deep feeling. Again, the idea of having a good heart. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, very famous thinker, put it this way. He said he believed that deep thinking is attainable only by a man of deep feeling. Again, deep thinking is attainable only by a man of deep feeling. What do you think? Do you think there is a connection between one's ability to think deeply and one's ability to feel deeply? Before moving on to a discussion of some of Emerson's very specific ideas about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives, let me give a brief overview of his life. Emerson was born in 1803 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was born a few years after George Washington had died. At age 8, Emerson's father, who had been a minister, died. At age 14, yes, age 14, Emerson entered Harvard College and graduated from Harvard at the age of 18. Several years later, he returned to Harvard to enter Harvard's Divinity School. And at age 26, Ralph Waldo Emerson was ordained a Protestant minister. At age 28, after being married for a year and a half, his wife died. At age 31, after having served as a minister for 5 years, Emerson left the ministry, never to return. He now embarked on a new career as a lecturer and writer. And it was as a lecturer and writer that Emerson eventually became very famous, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. At age 32, Emerson married for the second time. You recall his first wife had died. He had several children by this second marriage. At age 39, Emerson's child, his 5-year-old child, Waldo, died. And as a result of Emerson's child dying, both he and his wife went into a depression. At age 58, when Emerson was 58, the Civil War began. Remember, I pointed out that Emerson was a long-time opponent of slavery. That long before even Lincoln had opposed slavery, Emerson had given speeches calling for its abolition. Emerson died at age 79 in Concord, Massachusetts, and again, as I pointed out before, by this time he had become a very famous person. Today, Emerson is best known for his essays, many of which began as lectures. Emerson is regarded as a great essayist. Indeed, literary critic Harold Bloom, in his book entitled The Western Canon, a book in which he tells us which writers he thinks have been the greatest writers in the Western tradition, Bloom, who, by the way, is Professor Emeritus at Yale, Bloom claims that Emerson and Montaigne have been the greatest essayists in the Western tradition. By the way, if you're interested in procuring some of Emerson's essays, you can go to Barnes & Noble or any other very fine bookstore, and you'll find books which are collections of Emerson's essays, which also provide some biographical information about him. The common theme running through Emerson's essays is that of the fulfilling life. In other words, the idea or the theme Emerson was most interested in writing about, was what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. And very specifically, in some of his essays, he talks about what he considers to be the most important purposes of life. In other words, why are we here? What are we supposed to accomplish? Well, Emerson believed that our lives have several purposes, but that the chief purpose of our lives is to become a very decent human being. That's the number one purpose why we are here on earth. Again, to become very decent human beings. He also believed another purpose of our existence is to grow in self-knowledge. To grow in self-knowledge. Emerson attached a lot of importance to the Greek maxim, know thyself. Indeed, Emerson and the Greeks believed that knowing oneself was the basis, the foundation of wisdom. Besides growing in self-knowledge, Emerson believed another important purpose of life is self-cultivation, self-development. What this involves, what self-cultivation, what self-development involves, is learning about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives and then implementing those ideas. I mentioned before that Emerson believed that one of our purposes in being here is to grow in self-knowledge, and by that he meant that we must engage in introspection, in self-examination, and what Emerson really believed was that if we do engage in introspection, it will help us to wake up. Emerson very much liked Buddhism, and of course the Buddha, the title the Buddha really means the one who waked up. And Emerson believed that if we were to grow in self-knowledge, if we were to grow in self-awareness, we would learn more about what is good in us and also what is bad in us. I think the French thinker Pascal illustrates very well Emerson's thinking on this topic of human nature. Pascal said, there are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, also provides some illumination. Jung believed we can only deal with our potential for evil if we recognize the potential for evil in us. And of course, also, Jesus spoke about this. In a very famous parable, Jesus said this, why do you see the speck? Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Jesus went on to say this, you hypocrites, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly enough to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Writer Ernest Becker, like Emerson, often focused on man's penchant for his inhumanity to his fellow man. And Ernest Becker, on the subject of man's inhumanity to man, said this: all through history, it has been the average normal men who have laid waste to the world. Again, all through history, it has been the average normal men who have laid waste to the world. And what might be some examples of this? Religious wars, wars of conquest, racism, torture, all carried out by so-called average normal men. Some very specific examples would involve, for example, the Spanish conquest of Latin America. You will recall the Spanish treated the Indians in a very brutal way, so that as a result of the Spanish conquest of America, most of the Indian population was wiped out. And who carried out the Spanish conquest of Latin America? Average, normal men. And one final example, as I'm running short on time here, the Nazi Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews perished. And who carried out this Holocaust? Who was responsible for all of this anti-Semitism? Who was responsible for torturing and killing Jews and humiliating them long before they were tortured and killed? Average, normal Germans. I'll have much more to say about this next week. And indeed, next week, we'll focus in on some very specific Emersonian ideas about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. But as usual, I'd like to conclude with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. In Walden, his masterpiece, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."